I have been seeing people asking for book recommendations. So what I thought I would do is share my favorite books with all of you. There might be something in there that you like. So right now I'm reading Julie Andrews' Homework, and I have to say I'm really enjoying it. I was a fan of Mary Poppins growing up and The Sound of Music. I still love them. So I read Julie's first book, Home, a number of years ago, and it was really interesting to me, and I think it was interesting because I was always a Julie fan because of what I had watched growing up. Homework is, it's a story of her life. It's the continuation of Home. However, this starts when she starts filming Mary Poppins. So at the very beginning, there's a very brief sort of breakdown of what was in Home, so you don't need to read that. But this is a fantastic one, and it's old school Hollywood at its best and its greatest, and the actors that she worked with and the directors and producers are phenomenal. And Julie comes across in all interviews and all of that as quite prim and proper, or that was always my interpretation of her. And she's had a really interesting life. So this is a great one. It's a very easy read, and I've almost finished it in about 3 days. Because I am such a fan of biographies, I thought I would continue along that sort of genre. Richard Branson's Losing My Virginity. I read that a lot of years ago, but it's something that sits with me. And the reason I think that it does, and the reason I enjoy autobiographies, is because I enjoy the understanding the way people are able to achieve the things that they do in their lives. And Richard Branson, whether you like him or hate him, he took risks in his life that no sane person would take, and he managed to turn it around. And if he did screw up along the way, he was always able to find a way out of it. And I take my hat off to brilliance like that, and I take my hat off to anyone that can build the empire that Richard Branson has built for himself without, you know, a rich dad or family funding their success. So that was a great one. It's one that sits in my mind to this day, especially if I'm sort of looking for some sort of inspiration. I put that book down and thought, I really can conquer the world. So I'm noticing a theme. Like I said, I do really enjoy biographies, and I will share my favorite fiction books a little bit later on. But Elvis is one of my favorite singers of all time. I actually shouldn't say one of, he is my favorite singer of all time. I mean, no matter what mood I'm in, I can listen to the king. I have read a lot of books on Elvis, and so many of them are quite boring because they're very factual, and it's just compiling all the stuff that is already out there about him that you may have seen in documentaries or just read here and there. So I have 2 books on Elvis that I couldn't put down. One of them is Elvis and Me by Priscilla. So the story of their relationship as told by her. This book I think I read in a couple of days, and I was working full time when I read it. I just could not put it down because it's all the personal stuff that you wouldn't know, and the fact that she opened it up and talked about it without hiding anything was so fascinating to me. And the other one, which I bought when I was at Graceland by Jerry Schilling, was Me and a Guy Named Elvis. And it's a story of their friendship, but in it, I was obsessed with this book when I was reading it as well, but in it, it talks about how they met. There are all these stories about just private little intimate moments and encounters that they had, and things they experienced on their road trips, you know, traveling from Memphis to LA and all that sort of stuff. It was such a great book. The only thing is the last sort of quarter of it made me really angry, and there's no spoilers in this because we know how the story ends, but decisions that were made by people surrounding Elvis really upset me, and I thought he was such an incredible talent, and maybe if some of those decisions had have been made differently, Elvis would still be here and we would have gotten some more music from him. An interesting thing, when I was reading the book, I was speaking to someone and talking about my anger towards the Colonel, and they floated something that I believe is true, but I don't have confirmation, so I don't know, but that the Colonel was an illegal immigrant, and that was why Elvis was never able to tour outside of the country, so to Europe or Australia. And the reason is obviously that wouldn't have affected Elvis, but Elvis would have had to have gone without the Colonel, and the Colonel didn't want to lose control of his biggest and only client. And so that affects everything and changes everything. And this motherfucker stopped Elvis from being able to do so many things. Anyway, Me and a Guy Named Elvis, such a great book, so definitely worth reading if you are an Elvis fan. Know My Name by Chanel Miller is something that I read very recently. This one's a little heavy, I'm not going to lie. So if you don't already know, Chanel Miller is the woman whose victim impact statement went viral in 2016. She was sexually assaulted behind a dumpster on the Stanford campus, and she tells her side of the story, how she dealt with, how she found out of her assault, the handling of the case by the media, the reporting in terms of Brock and all his swimming achievements. It was a very powerful book for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, it's very hard for men to understand what it is when a woman talks about being violated and sexual assault. And I'm not saying that no men understand, I'm just saying it's a harder concept because we live in very different bodies. I think it's very important because Chanel writes beautifully and very descriptively about her experiences, and I think she is able to explain it very, very well. The other thing is, through her experience of going through the trial and this whole process, there was a whole lot of victim shaming that was directed at her, and I think at the time they were calling her Emily Doe. But so much victim shaming about what she should have done, how she should have handled it, all of this sort of stuff. And there just shouldn't be any victim shaming. I don't care what you have done. Nobody deserves to be raped or sexually assaulted. And for that reason, I think every adult on this planet should read this book to be able to grasp the ways in which someone is affected by all of this. And look, there are plenty of books out there which talk about this sort of subject matter, not necessarily this case, but I think that this was so wonderfully written, and Chanel was so open in her descriptions, and she left nothing untouched or unturned. She opened herself up when writing this, and if you're brave enough, I think this is an incredible book just for insight and understanding, and also to get angry again about the sentence that Brock received. I would like to say thank you to Chanel for writing such an incredible piece of work. True crime is another genre that I love to read. Again, I like the psychology behind people making the choices that they make. And I think that's because they make choices that never in a million years would I make, but they do, and I just want to understand why. So Marching Powder by Rusty Young was such a fantastic book. Drug smuggling and ending up in a Bolivian prison. I mean, it's an incredible story. The other one is The Iceman, and that is the story of Richard Kuklinski, who was a mob hitman. When my friend handed me that book to read, she said to me, "You're not going to be able to read certain parts, it's quite graphic." I didn't find it that graphic. Maybe there's a little bit of a twisted streak in me, but I loved reading every part of it. And after I finished reading The Iceman, I was so fascinated by this guy because there was an awkwardness to Richard Kuklinski, and so I went online and watched all of the interviews that I could find, and it was just fascinating to watch. And he was awkward. I don't recall if it talked about him being on the autistic spectrum or something, but there seemed to be a disorder and a disconnect from normal emotion and empathy with this man. And so fascinating on many levels. Psychologically, it was fascinating, finding out why he did what he did and the choices that he made. The fact that he couldn't be inducted, or I don't know what the right term is, but sort of taken into any of the mob families because he was Polish, he was not Italian. So he sort of worked for all of them. And then in these interviews, there's one particular part that I watched where he was talking to a female reporter, and he tried to flirt or make a joke, and it was so awkward, but there was something I liked about him. I'm not condoning what he did, I'm just saying, fascinating. So both of those are worth a read. Okay, my favorite book of all time is Samba, the World's Greatest Lion. Samba is the MGM lion that you see roaring at the beginning of any of the MGM movies. So Samba is one of the first animals ever reward trained in Hollywood. Back in the day when Samba was around, it was the days where they used to break these animals down. It was fear training. It was brutal, and this man had always wanted to raise a lion, and the stars aligned, and Samba was brought to him. Samba was an orphaned cub. Anyway, this is the story of Samba and the connection between the man who raised him and trained him and all of that. I read this book in one day. I remember the day I started reading it, my ex left the house. I was sitting on the couch in my bathrobe reading this book. He came home. I was in exactly the same position with the dogs on my lap, still reading the book, and I was very close to the end. I just could not put it down. And all of a sudden I started sobbing uncontrollably. And he looked at me and thought there was something seriously wrong, and there was. It was parts of this story, but the greatest read I've ever had. So that's my pick. Okay, and for those of you that like fiction, I have to admit I don't read a whole lot of fiction. I find a lot of it to be very predictable, and sci-fi and fantasy isn't really what keeps me interested or focused. But when I was younger, I read something after my sister handed me the book, and that was A Woman of Substance by Barbara Taylor Bradford. It's very much a sweeping saga that starts in the 1800s and moves into the 1900s. I loved this book, and it is one of the few books that I will pick up every few years and reread. And there are 3 books in the series, which are Hold the Dream and To Be the Best. So if that sort of sweeping saga is something that you're into, A Woman of Substance, read it. Barbara Taylor Bradford's best work. So there you have it. Those are my favourite books. If you have any suggestions for me to read, please put them in the comments below. Happy reading.